Thank you for joining me for Session 11 in Explore the Bibles, the study of Ezekiel and Daniel. This lesson is entitled Trust Exhibited, and the passage is Daniel 6, chapter 6, verse 10 through 24. The way I'm going to introduce it is what was suggested in goexplorethebible.com, and I looked up an article entitled 2022's America's Most Trusted. And in this article, it goes down through a whole list of things that I'm going to select some of those, maybe half a dozen, and ask people if they could name the brand that's most trusted. For example, the most trusted credit card. It's a Kohl's credit card. And they have all kinds of things that are there, refrigerators and cars and those kinds of things, just to get the class started. And then I'm going to ask them, what makes you trust a company or to trust a particular brand? And we'll talk about that. Well, there are elements that are involved in biblical faith. And I want to explain what those are to the class. They involve knowledge, assent, you agree that that is true, and then also you obey, you act upon it, you yield. So the three words that I'm going to write on the board are knowledge, assent, and obedience. And I'm going to talk through that. In order to have faith, biblical faith, you need to know some stuff. And so that's why it's so important for Christians to be sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. People need to hear the good news in order to have faith in the good news. The second part of biblical faith is assent or agreement. You believe Jesus did die on the cross. He was buried in a tomb and then he rose from the grave. And you agree that that's what brought salvation and forgiveness of sin and reconciliation with the Holy God. You agree that's true. He really did die, and that really was what it accomplished. But the third aspect, there are lots of people that believe those things, know those things, but they don't act upon those things. Their life is not based upon that. They haven't yielded their life and control of their life to that. An example would be the demons. And yet, biblical faith also yields to that. You see the evidence of biblical faith in obedience. And so I'm wanting the class to understand those elements. And in our study of Ezekiel and Daniel, what have we been taught about God? What is our knowledge about God? And there are a number of things that the class could share with you. The sovereignty of God. God is present with you in all circumstances. God is a rescuer. We've seen that a number of times in the book of Ezekiel and Daniel. God is a judge. God is powerful. All of those things, plus many others of what we've been taught about God. We can trust God because of His actions that we've seen in these books, of His attributes that have been displayed in these books, of His character that we understand, and also of His attributes. And so these are things we've been taught, so we have knowledge about God. Now, Daniel is 80 plus years of age. I've read some studies that say that he may have been 90 years. Most of the time they put him around 83 years old. And all of this has been his experience with God. That God is sovereign, God is present, God is rescuer, God is judge, God is powerful. This is something that he agrees this is true. So he has knowledge, he has assent. And now what we're seeing in this passage in Daniel chapter 6, he is acting based on his knowledge that he believes is true about God. Daniel trusts God. And our lesson summary statement says believers can trust God in all circumstances. Daniel chapter 6 is a transitional passage in the sense of it's transitioning from the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire. And in this passage, Babylon is not going to be anymore. The Persian king is referred to as Darius. The scholars tell us they believe he was an older man, maybe 62 years of age. So he ought to have been a wiser king. There are 120 satraps or rulers or governors over the empire. And Darius has taken those 120 and he has built another hierarchy of 3 in which these will report to. It was a way to ensure that the money was collected for the empire. It was a way in which to protect the king from coming harm. And it says in chapter 3 of Daniel, maybe it's verse 5, that he had an extraordinary spirit. There was something unusual about Daniel. It wasn't just that he had a charming personality. It wasn't just that he did things exceedingly well, but there was something unusual about Daniel, and we come to understand it's because the first thing on Daniel's list was to worship God. And that had created this wonderful spirit, this attitude, this work ethic that Daniel had. So the test comes because Daniel is good, not because he is bad. And the first verses of Daniel chapter 6 are establishing that Daniel didn't deserve this persecution. So our first point is the trap is set. And I would ask a member to read verses 10 through 14. And then after they have read, I would ask them to listen to me read to them from Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. And in that passage, Paul is saying to the Christians in Rome that they are to be obedient to the government. They're to be submissive and respectful of the government. And what I'm wanting to do is, how do you justify Daniel's civil disobedience in the light of what Paul is saying to the Christians in Rome? And of course, we have other examples of civil disobedience. James and John, John and Peter in the book of Acts, when they were told to stop preaching about Jesus, and they said, we can't help but do that. You do what you have to do. We're going to do this. We're going to continue to tell people about Jesus. And so what I'm wanting to do is say that bring us to the point where there are times when a government will ask a Christian to stop something and a Christian cannot obey. Or there's a law that is passed and it is an unjust law and a Christian cannot obey that law. So why didn't Daniel close the windows and pray silently? Why didn't Daniel pray secretly as well as pray silently? If Daniel would have done that, that would have avoided all of this. And so I'm wanting them to answer that question. Why didn't Daniel do that? To do so would have given in precisely to the idolatry that the state was demanding of the people. If the government makes claims that amount to divine status, then even prayer becomes a political act. And you are affirming the reality of a higher authority than the government when you worship God and when you pray to God. Now, Daniel's life developed this extraordinary spirit, and it's because of his trust in God. And that is expressed through his prayer life. And so before we move off of this text, I want to take a moment to talk about his prayer life. And I want him to give me some answers. What is it that you notice about Daniel's prayer life? And there are just a number of things. Let me just read through the text and point some things out. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house. The windows in its upstairs room opened towards Jerusalem. Daniel had built a room on top of his roof. The roofs were flat, and on top of there he could catch a breeze, and so it could be cooler in the winter times. Summertime, and the windows opened towards Jerusalem, and that's probably coming from Solomon when he dedicated the temple, and he said, wherever God's people may be scattered, if they'll look in this direction and pray, God will hear. And so what's happening is Jerusalem and the temple represent the presence of God. And so it was a way as a reminder of the presence of God when they prayed. And the fact that he would be praying for a reestablishment of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. And it says he prayed in this upstairs room, and he prayed 3 times a day. There's nowhere in the Old Testament that he's required to do this. This is his practice in terms of him worshiping and connecting with God. It said he got down on his knees to pray. Again, that's not typical of a Jewish way of praying. The typical posture for Jews when they prayed was to stand and to hold their hands this way, their hands being faced towards heaven and their hands opened as if they're asking God to fill their hands with His blessings and with their request. And so the fact that he got on his knees was a sign of humbling his heart before God. And he gave thanks to his God just as he had done before. This was the habit of Daniel. He wasn't doing anything out of the usual nature for him. And they knew that. They knew there was nothing about his work and nothing about his character that they could find wrong with him. They're going to use his religion against him. And notice, here he is, and he's giving thanks. And he knows that what he's done has put his life at peril. Imagine that. It goes on to say, he gave thanks to his God just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. They were eyewitnesses to his praying. Now notice it says that he gave thanks, and then the second thing it says he's petitioning, he's supplicating God. It would be interesting to know what he was praying for. Some commentators say that he's not only praying for himself, but he was praying for the king. And maybe he was praying and asking God to give him the strength that he needed in order to face what was coming. But here's the two aspects of his prayer life: thanksgiving and petition. It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to know what he was being thankful to God for in the midst of this difficulty. Now, we know that he had a place to pray. We know he had a method to pray. We knew that his prayer included thanksgiving and petition. There's just so much that we can learn from Daniel in this matter of prayer. And after your class has had a time to pray, you may want to follow that up. Do you have a place to pray that is quiet, and when you go there you can concentrate in your prayer? Do you have a method that you follow in praying? Do you have a scheduled time and a consistency in which you pray? There's just so many things. Do you kneel when you pray? What do you do to humble your heart before God in prayer? So the first thing that we see here is that a trap was set, and what they did was they put a conflict between him and his God, and they sought to make the state's rule greater than his devotion and his service to God. There was a form of idolatry that they had put before Daniel, and he chose to serving God as opposed to serving the idol. The second point is the door shut. Chapter 6, verse 15 to 18. It says, "Then these men went together to the king and said to him, 'You know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed.' So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den." And of course, the passage before talked about how he had spent all day trying to prevent this from happening. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you." Now, it's said in an emphatic way in the original text. And the way that our English text points that out is it adds this word continually. It could have said, "May your God whom you serve rescue you." But he notices something about Daniel. Daniel is a man whose life is given over to the service of God. There's no conflict between his occupation, his career, and his service to God. Everything Daniel did was an act of service to God. The way he did his job, the kind of man that he was, and the way he related to others, his respect for the king, all of that was recognized by this man as him serving his God. This was a man who strongly served God. That's what he's pointing out. "And may that God, whom you give that much service to, may he rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. That statement, nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed, that's mentioned 4 times in this chapter, in verse 8, in verse 12, and in verse 15. And they took some kind of clay, and maybe it was on a chain, or maybe it was at the seal of the stone next to the ground over the cave. But somewhere on that, they had these clay seals, and the king put his impression in it, and these men put their impressions. The nobles put their impression in it. Now, maybe the king wanted to do that so that these men would not be able to come back in the middle of the night and ensure that Daniel was dead. Maybe the nobles did this so they wanted to ensure that the king couldn't come back in the middle of the night and rescue Daniel, possibly from this lion's den. But the point of it was, he was there and he was not getting out. This was his permanent condition. There was no chance of rescue from anyone outside of that lion's den. And then verse 18, then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. Now, in Jewish culture, when fasting is involved, an unstated subject was praying. And so, as Jewish people would read this text, they would understand that the king spent the night, imagine this, fasting and praying. So it's showing that this king was greatly concerned and about Daniel and wanting his rescue. Earlier, it said that they had asked the king to establish this practice of no one praying to any god or to any priest except for the king, and they asked for 30 days. Another matter about Jewish culture is 30 days is oftentimes associated with death. And what it's conveying is they desperately wanted Daniel dead. Now, there's much about the king's circumstances that are like ours when it comes to being able to rescue persecuted Christians. And that is all that's left for us in many cases is we can pray. We can influence our government to put pressure upon other governments. We can do those kinds of things to try to elevate the awareness of Christians being persecuted around the world. And by the hundreds of millions, Christians are being persecuted in this world in various places by various governments. I found a site by Franklin Graham, and Franklin Graham, 5 Ways to Pray for the Persecuted Christians. I'm going to make copies of that and give it to my Sunday school class. And each of those 5 prayers, 5 ways to pray for persecuted Christians, I'm going to ask 5 people who would take one of those. There's just a brief paragraph that's associated with each way to pray for persecuted Christians. And I'm going to take time in our class and ask each of the persons who agrees to read that paragraph for me, if they would also offer a prayer along those lines. And we'll just do what this king did for Daniel. We're going to take a moment to pray for persecuted Christians. The second Sunday of November is Pray for Persecuted Christians Sunday. And that might be something that you want to put on your calendar, and when the second Sunday in November comes, your class, you spend time praying for persecuted Christians. But the door is shut. And this is what the king could do in terms of benefit for Daniel. He fasts and he prays for Daniel. And it seems to me in this text, this is something that we can identify with. The third point, the tables turned. And I'm going to say to the class, as I read through and explain, I want you to keep in mind that Daniel is powerless to rescue himself. All he could do was to trust God. So what is it that you need to trust God with in some difficulty that you're facing? Some circumstance, some person, some issue, and it's a difficulty for you. And I want you to keep in mind, whatever that is, as we read through these last verses of our lesson for Daniel. I'm going to make some comments along the way. At the first light of the dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. Many people have pointed out the similarities between this and the resurrection story of Jesus. The first light of dawn, the women are going to the tomb. This king, it says at the first light of dawn, he got up and he hurried to the lion's den. Now, that would have been a shocking statement because kings don't run. They don't hurry. It was something of an embarrassment for someone of authority to do that. One of the points of the story of the prodigal son is when the father sees the son coming, he runs to the son. And that is shocking for that culture in that day. The patriarch of the family doesn't do this. Here is the king doing something that's not very dignified. He's running to the tomb to find out if Daniel is alive, if he possibly could be. Verse 20, when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel. That word cried out is a word that is associated with a lament, a funeral dirge. It's a sad voice. He's not expecting to hear Daniel. And Daniel, servant of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? Isn't that an amazing statement? Isn't it an amazing action on the part of this king? That possibly this God of Daniel's has actually stopped the lions, because that was the only hope Daniel had. The king, the most powerful man in the land, he didn't have the power to do it because of this law, the Medes and the Persians. If Daniel's going to survive, it's going to have to be God that rescues him. Verse 21, then Daniel spoke with the king. May the king live forever. That is just a protocol. That is a polite way of addressing the king. And then he says, my God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth. He gives all the credit to God. And they haven't harmed me. For I was found innocent before him, and also before you, your majesty. I have not done harm. Now notice something in this passage. He says, the lions haven't harmed me. And then he uses that word again when he says, I haven't harmed you. I'm innocent. Now he's not saying he's perfect, but he's simply saying that he's been vindicated, that he is a man of righteousness, and that he's done what is the right actions. Verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found unharmed. It's just like the three Hebrews that went into the fire. When they came out, there was no evidence, no sign of the fire. Here, Daniel comes out and he doesn't have a tooth mark or a claw mark anywhere on his body. For he trusted in his God. That's the key reason for Daniel's deliverance. It wants us to know it's his trust in God. And the word trust there has the idea about firmness and certainty. It conveys the idea of leaning on something for support. And that's what Daniel had done. And then in verse 24, the king then gave the command, and those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. They, their children, and their wives. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now, let's be clear, that is not God's will. That's not what God says in His Word. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16, it says, the fathers won't be punished for the son's sin, and the sons won't be punished for the father's sin. But in Persian legal system, if you made an accusation against someone that was false and it required death on the person that you accused, and it was proven that you had done so falsely, then you took their place and you experienced the punishment of it. The Persians also had this policy that it not only would involve you, it would involve your family. And so it's a very serious matter, as you could imagine, accusing someone falsely of a crime that deserved the death sentence. And so it was also another way of saying there certainly wouldn't be any revenge or coming back upon the king, because all of the family had been destroyed. Now, it wasn't all 120 satraps in their family. It was probably just a small nucleus that had conspired against Daniel. But understand, God must have wept over this action that was taking place when these innocent people were thrown to the lions. The lions were a way in which the Persians did execute capital punishment. They wouldn't have used fire like the Babylonians did with the 3 Hebrew children, because they worshiped fire. And so they wouldn't have used that as a means of capital punishment. The Romans also used lions as a way of capital punishment upon people. Now, I've read through that and I've explained that. And so I had asked the class to keep in mind, what is it that they need to trust in God? Is it a circumstance? Is it a person, a relationship? Is it some situation in which they're needing to trust God in this circumstance? And what I want to do is go back to the beginning when I talked about biblical faith. What knowledge do you need in order to respond in a way that's trusting God when it comes to that situation? What is it, the truth that you need to come to accept? This is the truth about this matter. And what is the action based upon that knowledge and that truth? What's the action that you need to take to respond in that circumstance in a way that's honoring to God, a way that is redeeming towards that relationship with the other person or that situation? How do you trust God in that circumstance? Now, there are occasions when God vindicates the believer, but it is not by rescuing him. He doesn't heal them. He doesn't restore the relationship. He doesn't give us the money. In those occasions, like the cross of Jesus, in those occasions, like the martyrdom of the disciples, in those occasions where we learn of Christians who actually died instead of being rescued, what does trust look like in those circumstances? How do those circumstances validate God and honor God? Because there are times when God just simply doesn't do what we would like for Him to do, and yet we trust Him. So I'm wanting to know, if this story had turned out differently, how is God validated? How does it continue to strengthen our faith? What does it reveal to us? And then after that discussion, here's the way I want to close the lesson. There's a piece that you can order called Explore the Bible Quick Source. And they will have at the end of the lesson some object lessons or some stories to help you weave into your lesson if you find them helpful. And this is the way I'm going to end my lesson, with this object lesson about 2 oranges. And I'll just read to you what it says here in case you don't have this source, the quick source. I mentioned before that I also order the youth version of the Leader's Guide, because I often find suggestions there, creative ideas that I can use in my lesson. It says, display 2 oranges, 1 peeled and 1 unpeeled, and a pitcher of water. Invite the group to guess what will happen when you place each orange in the pitcher of water. Then do it. The peeled orange will sink to the bottom, while the unpeeled orange will float. Invite the group to share their theories as to why this happens. An unpeeled orange is heavier, so you would think it would sink. But the peel of the orange actually traps air between the meat of the peel and the rind, causing it to float. Remove the peel, and the orange loses its buoyancy. This is a segue. At the beginning of Daniel 6, we see that Daniel's subordinates were jealous of his authority. They looked for something they could accuse him of, but they got nowhere. However, they knew Daniel prayed to God every day, so they convinced King Darius to pass a law saying no one could pray to anyone or anything except the king for 30 days. And then have someone read Daniel 6:10, and then ask, if you knew something you did regularly was against the law, would you keep doing it, stop doing it, or try to be less obvious about doing it? What would be your responses? Because there is one of those 3 responses. And then comment that Daniel was faced with the same choice about his habit of prayer. However, he understood something about prayer that his accusers didn't. He wouldn't be protected from the king's wrath if he stopped praying. He was protected from the king's wrath because he prayed. Like the peel of an orange, prayer is what allows us to stay afloat. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 5 says that the Lord is a shield to those who take refuge in Him. Close in prayer that the group would remain faithful to God despite what circumstances they're surrounded by. I read that in case you wanted to use that. You would have clearly the directions that were used. That's what I'm going to use to close my lesson. What a powerful lesson, wonderful lesson about trusting God in all circumstances. Thank you for teaching God's Word.